Talk to
Nice,
us a
Adam.
little bit about the situation in Cuba right now, so we've got some context to start with.
Well, it is a very complex situation in Cuba, obviously, with a series of shortage, electricity shortage, especially access to basic necessities. But we've seen throughout recent history, Cuba going through hardship and hard moment on different fronts. But always, the partnership that he had built with Venezuela, especially with in-kind payments of oil resources, providing nurses, professors, and others in exchange. All this is actually off the table now that the U.S. has seized control of the use of Venezuelan oil, and as a result, we're seeing some very strong scarcity and shortages on the entire economic front in Cuba.
Yeah, and I mean, Venezuela, as you said, it used to be the main provider of Cuba's oil. Trump has pledged to impose tariffs on any country that supplies it with oil as well. But the US Treasury said late last month that it would allow the resale of Venezuelan oil to Cuba's private sector. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, absolutely. So we've seen, I think it was February 25th, a decision to actually allow indeed direct sales to some, private entrepreneurs. And here the objective is definitely to try to break the consensus of in the island, trying to, play on the carrot versus stick, strategy. On the one side, showing that the U.S. could actually provide the needs from the population and try to actually shortcut the Cuban government that it sees as corrupt and nepotist, and in terms of control of the island. So there's been provided the supplies of diesel, especially to small private companies and entities, and on the other side, there's also this potential deal that the Trump administration has mentioned several times that could include a specific interest from the U.S. to control key infrastructure, maybe access to mineral commodities in exchange for support throughout the country, and therefore that might actually lead towards a potential transition or takeover, whether peaceful or by force, as the Donald Trump has mentioned a couple of times, depending on the decision from the Havana authorities.
Yeah, before the Iran strikes, Trump said he wanted a, quote, friendly takeover. How has the Cuban government responded to that? I mean, what would a friendly takeover, so to speak, look like?
So I mean, what we've seen in terms of early draft or insight is, as I was mentioning, the support from the U.S. in terms of providing new supplies of oil, probably Venezuelan oil from Louisiana, to Cuba in exchange for some kind of control of political institution, or at least replacement of the current Diaz-Canel president, who actually called the plan neo-colonialistic in its nature, and at the same time some level of agreement between the new authorities in La Habana that Donald Trump would put in place, and the U.S. in terms of managing port infrastructure, in terms of accessing some key capacities, economic capacities in the islands. So here, especially in terms of the mining sector, there's strong nickel capacity, nickel resources. There's gold also in Cuba. The question is whether or not these will actually be used to the benefits of the Cuban people, and if actually this will be appealing to a population that is direly suffering right now in terms of the scarcity of and access of electricity and capacity to move forward on their daily lives, but at the expense of their independence.
As supporters of sanctions argue economic pressure could lead to political and economic reforms. Critics say it makes things worse. What's your view?
Well, it's interesting because we've seen that strategy to try to release the pressure on Cuba in the past already. It was through the first Obama administration that Donald Trump was so critical of, and the objective here was to kind of support the rise of entrepreneurship, private entrepreneurship class, through tourism, through support of small contracts, and so that actually managed to facilitate a better life on the island, but indeed did not move anything in terms of the gridlock that we had in the hands of the Castro regimes and his descendants. The question is whether or not this new approach of whether strengthening even more sanctions, preventing any kind of energy supplies to Cuba, will actually encourage the population either to actually increase their demonstration. I mean, this demonstration has scarce by history in Cuba, but we've seen some movements in the streets. We've seen some discontentment, especially among the students, and whether or not by offering an opportunity for Diaz-Canel to leave the island and maybe putting in place the grandson of Raúl Castro. There's already been several conversations between Marco Rubio in the U.S. and the grandson of Raul Castro, whether or not that would actually provide an alternative that would be kind of supported by the United States, and in exchange also for economic relief and economic takeover of part of the island's infrastructure.
Just briefly, Remi, we heard Lindsey Graham say that Cuba is next, but of course, all the while, the US and Israel are striking Iran. There are counter strikes from Iran. And only in January, Maduro was taken from Venezuela, with the US taking over the oil there. What do you think is the broader picture here for Trump? What are we getting at?
I mean, Cuba has always been a priority for American foreign policy for several decades. It's also a key priority for Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who's is half Cuban and is leading that effort. We've seen also a specific focus of the Trump administration on the American continent, the Monroe Doctrine from 1914, that called sometimes Donroe Doctrine for his version from Donald Trump, of a focus on the Americas. Venezuela was the first country in terms of a hostile takeover. Actions in terms of removing the President Maduro a few months ago. Cuba was obviously next in line, and the current events in Iran was potentially triggered by other interests and foreign interests, whether Israel or others, into the region. But yes, definitely there was an idea of having a domino effect on Cuba for quite some time. It has been a very central element of foreign and domestic politics for the U.S. The importance of the Cuban diaspora in Florida. We've seen recently Miami electing for the first time a Democratic mayor, first time in 30 years, and that kind of shows that there's this commitment even in the backyard of Trump in Florida in terms of his policies, and I think that's why there's so much focus from the Trump administration to try to make a key change in Cuba that would actually clearly be heralded as a success on foreign policy that you could actually show around for the next few years.
All right, we'll leave it there. Remi Piet, really appreciate your time.
My pleasure, Sally.